Welcome to the Reasonable Southerner podcast. The South isn't all magnolias in the moonlight, but neither is it all racism and violence. We are just like you. My name is Frances Coleman. I share my insights about my life and yours. It was the first time I had ever heard the bells. The date was April the 30th, 1975. I was a senior at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches, Texas, where I was majoring in journalism and serving on the staff of the college newspaper. But we had the basics, including a wire service machine that sat in a corner, its keys steadily typing stories onto a fat roll of paper. We rarely used any of the stories. Our paper was devoted to campus news, but having the wire service machine helped familiarize students with how real newsrooms worked. On that particular day, the machine's bells began clanging noisily. Having never heard such a commotion, I and some other students rushed over to see what had prompted the machine to come alive with news flashes, alerts, and bulletins. The story was momentous indeed. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, had fallen. As the North Vietnamese army approached the city, the U.S., which had already withdrawn its troops from the country, evacuated remaining American personnel from its embassy, along with as many desperate South Vietnamese as it could. The Vietnam War was officially over. The photographs of an American punching a Vietnamese man as he attempted to climb the embassy gate, and the image of a Huey helicopter surrounded by people desperate to climb aboard it, were the final sad images of what has been called the First Television War. The generation that had come of age amid that televised coverage of the war and the burgeoning and sometimes bloody demonstrations against it was left to wonder what our country had accomplished. Why had we sent some 58,000 U.S. troops to their deaths? Why had we spent an estimated $168 billion, $1 trillion in today's dollars, on a war that, in retrospect, seemed pointless? And had we learned any lessons for the future? 46 years later, as we withdraw from Afghanistan after spending 20 years there militarily, my answers are, damned if I know, and apparently not. There are some comparisons. Far fewer American troops have died in Afghanistan, about 2,500, than in Vietnam, certainly, but each life lost is a tragedy for the families and for our country. Afghanistan has cost significantly more money. Citing Brown University's Cost of War project, the Washington Post estimates that the war has cost the U.S. more than $2 trillion. While I'm not sure those who have suffered at the airport at Kabul would agree, the evacuation of 115,000 people by the United States and its allies is a remarkable accomplishment amid the chaos of a crumbling regime. The wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan, though similar in some respects, are also different in many ways. Our government's questionable reason for being in Vietnam was to slow the spread of communism. We went to Afghanistan because it was a base for the terrorists who attacked New York and Washington on 9/11. We wanted to drive the terrorists out of Afghanistan and help create a more stable and democratic government there. We did extinguish many terror cells, but with the Taliban's takeover, we may yet see a rebloom of Afghanistan-based terrorism. Meanwhile, the country is not stable, nor is it democratic, and we may have been fools for thinking we could force stability and democracy on it. My oldest brother went to Vietnam as a member of the U.S. Army. He came back, thank God, with no visible wounds. My other brother, David Barrett, is a professor at Villanova University and a bona fide scholar. He has had a career writing about the CIA and the presidency. Over the authorship of 4 books, including Uncertain Warriors, Lyndon Johnson and His Vietnam Advisors, he's done a lot of archival research. I remain both haunted and impressed, he says, by a letter I found in 1989 in the papers of the late Senator Richard Russell of Georgia. The letter was in response to a constituent who had written Russell in 1966, asking why the U.S. was fighting a misguided war in Vietnam. The senator, my brother says, who had advised President Johnson in 1965 and President Kennedy before him against taking the U.S. into a major war in Vietnam, lamented to the constituent that opponents of the U.S. had, quote, outwitted us in getting us pinned down in the most unfavorable place in Asia to fight a war, unless it be Afghanistan. Unless it be Afghanistan. Let those words hang there for a moment. Remember that Russell wrote those words in 1966, long before the fall of Saigon, the Soviet Union's failed war in Afghanistan, and our 20-year war there. The fact that Afghanistan is a mighty unruly place is well known. The chaos at the airport in Kabul isn't the first time a foreign army has had a hard time getting out of the place. The British went there in the early 1800s because they didn't want the Afghans to cozy up to the Imperial Russian court. After installing their choice of ruler in Kabul, things went decidedly downhill for the British. 4,500 British soldiers and 12,000 camp followers were massacred as they attempted to evacuate Kabul and make their way to a British stronghold 90 miles away. Only one English soldier and a handful of Indians got there. Most were killed or died from the cold. It has been known to the British as the disaster in Afghanistan ever since. Did the British learn anything from their experience? They went back about 50 years later. Militarily, they were certainly more successful, managing to install their choice of Afghans as the nominal leaders in the government. It's important to remember what their objective was in all of this: just keep the Russians out. The Russians themselves fought a 10-year guerrilla war there in the 1980s. After shedding a lot of blood and spending a lot of money, they left too. They'll be back, of course, now that we've left. The cycle seems unbreakable. Clearly, we didn't learn much from our debacle in Vietnam and the Soviets' debacle in Afghanistan. Will we learn anything now from our war in Afghanistan? Once again, and all too familiarly, damned if I know. I'm Frances Coleman. I've worked for newspapers for more than 45 years, from Texas to my native Louisiana, and finally to my home near Mobile, Alabama. I've been a reporter, an editorial writer, a columnist, and an editorial page editor. I've commented on the BBC, been a guest on the Rachel Maddow Show, and had my column distributed nationwide. If you like this podcast, please follow it. It's free, and even if you don't like it, I hope you'll find it thought-provoking.